Hello, Pooja and Luke.
Hello.
Good
Hey, how are you doing?
How's it
Good to see
going?
you.
It's good to see you again, David.
I know it's been a while, and as I'm saying, I'll probably be saying to everybody today, it'll be wonderful seeing both of you in person after the pandemic craziness is over.
Indeed.
Yes, I can't
crave
believe it's still
people.
existing.
I know, right? All right. So this is about healthy organizations. You know, obviously a healthy org can refer to cultural, psychological safety, and much more. But just to start out, you know, why don't we focus on productivity? So, and this question for either of you or both of you, what metrics do you use to track if you want to know if your team is healthy? So, Pooja, how about we start with you?
You know, it's really hard to think about productive teams without happiness and sort of like psychological safety, right? So, you know, I will start with just being like, you gotta make sure that your teams are happy and healthy, especially in these times, because no matter what metric, you will start seeing those show up in their productivity. So like, I'll start there. I think from a healthy, productive team's perspective, right? I think the areas that I look at are, you know, we are a highly OKR driven team, right? You know, we establish strategic OKRs that are yearly and then quarterly OKRs. And within those, there's a lot of sort of leeway for teams to sort of position themselves around metrics that they think will move the business. And for me, the leading indicators are we achieving those metrics? And what I like about that is that it gives the teams flexibility to course correct, make decisions, learn, iterate, and then make some improvements, right? Versus originally where it would be sort of very like project task-based delivery, right? And you get a notion of like, you know, are we empowered as a team, right? So for me, the biggest metrics are like, are we hitting our OKR goals? And, you know, I'd love to have a conversation about OKRs at some point, right? Is that they don't necessarily have to be numbers based. There's a lot of phases of OKR deliveries, which are around, you know, build, deliver, adopt, that could be morphed or that could be customized for your teams. So you can get a sense of, are we achieving the targets that we were getting to? So I would say, you know, those are the things that first come to mind. I'd love to hear what Luke thinks about that.
Yeah, thank you, Pooja. These are great thoughts, and I agree with what you said. I would say for me, when I think about, you know, healthy teams, I think about sort of HR type metrics and org metrics. So, for example, I would look at the ratio of engineering managers to ICs, right? And in the typical, you know, well-functioning orgs that I've been involved in, you aim for like, you know, 5 to 10 engineers for one manager, you know, with 7 being the golden ratio, for example. I also think about the ratio of in each team of junior versus senior people. If you have only junior people, you can't really get much done, not enough context and perspective. If you have only senior people, they might, you know, step on each other's toes. And so the healthy balance there is usually leads to more productivity. I also think about different functions. So PM and Eng, you want to have also the right type of ratio there and the right alignment between the PM org and the Eng org, which again leads to more clarity, faster decision making. And then I look at, of course, diversity. You know, it's a well-known fact that, you know, diversity leads to also more happiness, which leads to more productivity. So it's something to also look at, and you can get metrics from that as well and track them. I love to also look at things like the promo rates. You know, so when you go through a performance management process, you want there to be a, you know, not too low, not too high, but like a healthy rate. And if you're out of bounds, that's a signal something is off. So these are all kind of metrics you can, you know, there are really org metrics that you can use as a signal that the team may have health issues.
It makes sense, and I imagine that there are some folks who are listening who would probably love to have the guidance of like, give me specific numbers for some of these things because they may be starting from scratch. I don't know if, you know, off the top of your head, if you think about like reasonable engineering managers to engineer ratios or reasonable PM to Eng ratios, just to give people an idea.
Yeah, so I would say, you know, from the, you know, world I come in, which has been, you know, Google and Lyft, I think that 7 engineers to 1 EM is about the right thing. And so, you know, that's one element of this. And for as far as PM to Eng, it depends on what they are focused on. So I would say for, the average ratio that I've seen across, different, orgs is about, 1 PM to about 10 engineers. That's a common thing, but, it can vary. If it's a very, infra, focused work, you may not need many PMs. If it's really you're building an app that's very, lots of UI design involved, lots of customer, experiences are driven from it, then you might want, more PMs. So, the ratio varies, but, 10 to 1 is about average. Maybe put an experience on this.
No, it was sort of +1 to the ratio, and we used to call it as the golden ratio, which is sort of hands on the keyboard to the number of people telling you what to do. And I've sort of, if you think of it that way, right? And it changes based on the area that you're responsible for. Like, you can look at these ratios across eng to product to design, platform engineering to product application engineering, right? So they're different at different stages, but I really feel like I 100% agree with you, Luke, is like, if you have more people telling you what to do, and not in like a negative sense, but just sort of like, if you have more people defining requirements based on the number of people who can produce those requirements, you're going to create tension no matter what, right? Because both sides are going to be unhappy, right? Because their reasons aren't being fulfilled. So being really deliberate about that, right? I would say is huge in sort of maintaining the balance in engineering and other functions.
That's a really good point. In fact, I've seen situations where you have too many cooks in the kitchen,
yes,
which leads to, again, unhappiness and lack of ability to move fast.
Totally. And, I'm reminded from Pooja what you were saying, right? Like we use these ratios, these numbers as kind of a reference point, but to your point, very unique situations may sometimes warrant very unique, arrangements, right? Sometimes that ratio might actually not work. Maybe it's too high, maybe it's too low, depending on what you work on. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. We have actually several folks who are already posting in their questions in the Q&A. Folks, as you have other questions, feel free to put them in. I would love to just move right into that to give folks an opportunity to ask their questions. This first one from Giuseppe is, I'm hearing a lot about team productivity. How do you define team productivity? Which KPIs specifically are you measuring? For either of you.
Yeah, I can sort of take that, and I'll still go back to the OKR framework, right? There's a hierarchy I think about, which is sort of like, there's business, there's company, and then there's team, and then there's personal, right? If you think of it that way, it's like business company is sort of top level. Then there's teams, and then there's personal OKRs, right? And if you think of that cascading framework, and I like to think of it in that manner, because a very happy, healthy team not delivering for the business or the company is not a good team either, right? And I see that a lot, is that, like survey results for that manager are amazing, yet the team's not delivering, and sort of like the right metrics are not being moved. So I think there's an important balance to maintain across those three, right? So I look at, again, going back to like, is your team delivering to the company initiatives? And you need to, if you are in very platform infra teams, that your initiatives don't obviously line up to like an active client growth or a revenue cloak, you have to work harder to figure out what that means to enable those. Right. Then sort of like the team level is, I still go back to your sort of like normal Scrum Agile principles, right? Is the teams decide on a weekly, bi-weekly basis what it means to achieve a goal. And they all agree that with their stakeholders and are accountable to their coworkers. And then finally, the third ones are personal OKRs. And these are set between you and your manager around how are you tracking towards whatever career aspiration you've set up for yourself. So I know I'm not being very specific. I want to move away from some old school understandings of, like lines of code and sort of number of tests written. Like it just feels like God knows how many years ago people used to think that way. But those are interesting inputs, but they need to add up to one of these goals in my mind.
It's an interesting thought in that, like, I know for myself most recently, like I was measuring some of those things, but lines of code, obviously, right? Like maybe if you have too many lines of code, that's maybe a negative sign, finesse. But then there's some benefit in terms of looking at like code duplication, like how redundant are you, et cetera. But 100%, it's like that higher level takeaway that you're describing that's more important. And just because you get, as you were saying, great survey results and people are happy, doesn't mean that, maybe you don't have ruinous empathy, if you will, just to quote a radical candor concept. So I appreciate that very much. Luke, how about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, totally. First plus one to what Pooja said, I think makes complete sense. I would say, in particular, the piece where when you look at engagement survey results, and some managers may be super highly rated and loved by their reports, but that doesn't necessarily mean the team is healthy. Maybe the team isn't even shipping. So this number should be, one input to broader evaluation. I do think that there's maybe some value in tracking sort of the number of, PRs or how often the team ships. Not maybe for the absolute numbers, but to track the deltas. You see if something happened when that those numbers drop or go up. That might tell you that something is up, and maybe a signal again for you to look at to dig deeper. But there's no absolute number that makes any sense to use. It's so varied across teams.
Makes sense. This next question from Yongli, this is an interesting one. I know that there are probably folks who are listening who may not find that their organization right now or their team or their boss is the healthiest to be a part of. So the question is, if you're part of an unhealthy organization, whether that be people leaving, product issues, leaders not being empathetic, do you leave or do you try to improve it when you're not in management or that executive management tier? And if you try to improve, what are some ideas?
Well, maybe I can start there. I think, if there are issues in your team that you can see, I would say, if you still believe in the mission of the unit or the company you're part of, right, you should make sure that the right people are aware of these issues. So what I would do is, first off, try to have a conversation with your manager. And then if you don't get anywhere, I would talk to their manager or HR and raise the issues at least. Maybe you not be the first one to raise these kind of issues. And again, it's possible that you're aware of these, but they've been not obvious to others. And so again, by bringing it up, you will help solve the problem. If people don't know there's a problem, they can't really solve it. So that'd be my advice. Start there.
Sounds like fail loudly, essentially. Make sure that folks are aware of the
Get
problem.
your voice heard.
Yeah.
I might take I'll take a different spin to it from a manager perspective. Like, what is your responsibility to make sure your ears are on the ground and you're hearing that you have dissatisfied teams or dissatisfied individuals? One of the things that I've started recently has been interesting is the whole, with everyone being remote and distributed, you sort of lose the hallway chatter to some extent, right? And to me, those sort of like random chance sort of incidences would teach me a lot. So what I started is like an office hour, right? Is that, people can just up to you 15-minute slots if you want to come connect, let's talk. And it's been fairly interesting to learn things through that, right? Because by the time as a leader, depending on where you are in the organization, you do get filtered information. And, and I wouldn't say that there's any malice or bias associated with it, but it's natural. Like, this is how information flows. So being able to have forums where you can actually get that hallway chatter, it would be a good way to from a manager's perspective, to learn that, what's going on in your organization. I'll give you an example that was something completely that I didn't notice, that we were seeing a lot of there were areas that we were seeing a lot of movements of teams, right? People moving from one team to the other. And on one way you can look at it is like, great, we're creating rehire moments for people. There's interesting work. So it's an open opportunity. So there's an amazing positive side to internal movement. There's a shadow side to it, which is, are people running away from something? Are they running away from the work that they're doing? Are they running away from too many projects to achieve? Is there too many hard deadlines with changing priorities? Don't know. Right. So when I would say is like, there's a lot of onus on the manager to get a sense of this, But I agree that it's two-sided. Like if you are in that team, you need to raise your voice, but it's hard to do that at times. And the responsibility has to be split.
100%.
If I may add to what you said, Pooja, I think the value of office hours is really, really great. I think unfiltered info coming from anybody in your team, and also having this forum for them to reach out. They know they can reach you at least once a week for a 15-minute slot. That's very, very useful. I would say one more thing is, you're right. It's very difficult, especially now, to keep your ear to the ground and to sort of through hallway chatter or other sort of informal methods sort of gather data points and sort of unhappiness of some people. And so in my case, I find it to be very valuable to have some people in the org, be it your chief of staff or your head of HR or your recruiter, or people that are approachable, that know the org and that people can typically talk to when they have a problem. So these people then are your early warning signal that there's some health issue in the org.
So this is, and now actually with you two now, we now have 3 out of 3 folks who've presented so far who've shared that during times like this or during the pandemic or otherwise, that when water cooler chat, so to speak, doesn't exist, that you need to have some way to simulate that, to recreate that while we're in kind of this unique space. And whether that be office hours or some other means, it needs to be created manually when it doesn't exist naturally in the environment. Yeah, 100%. This next question from Vasu, can you please, and I'm guessing this is probably related to Pooja, you were mentioning OKRs earlier. Can you please share some guidelines for defining OKRs and probably share some examples, maybe an example or two?
Sure. I really believe in cascading OKRs. And let me explain what I mean with that is that I think going back to the same sort of like there's the business company, there's team, and then there's personal, right? Sort of like when you think about those levels, like I imagine every organization at some cadence has company level OKRs, right? And like, for example, at Stitch Fix, we might have a company level OKR that says we want to grow active clients by X%. Right, that is a strategic OKR, and we are going to invest in that. When you think about your team, you can take that OKR and understand from your team's perspective, what is the work that you will do to address that OKR, to move forward that OKR. Now, it's very possible if you're looking at a quarterly boundary that, I don't know, like if we said we want to have an increased 10% active client growth over the year, you're not going to be able to achieve 8% of that in a small amount of time, right? However, you can make clear, you can think about clear projects or investments that you can make that your team has a hypothesis that can support that, right? So it could be, we're going to change our onboarding flows and reduce friction for new clients to join, right? That's a clear that's an OKR. There's results that you can associate with it. So for example, if your onboarding flow takes a minute today, you can say, your team is going to reduce it by 30 seconds, right? So that's a clear one that maps up to a strategic OKR and has some amount of flexibility, because it doesn't say what you're going to do with the onboarding flow. It still says, I'm going to align it to the company. This is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to measure how I made progress towards it, right? So that's sort of like, that's how I would look at OKRs. I saw some folks doing measure what matters. I think those are great. I would highly recommend reading through that book. The simpler your OKRs are, the more effective your organization is going to get to.
The takeaway I get, in addition to what you're describing, is that the OKRs themselves are a communication vehicle, and so using them in kind of that trickle down way enables that effective communication. And like most communications, the more concise, the better.
Totally. If I may add, I think first of all, +1 to everything Pooja said. OKRs are very critical part of running a healthy org. And in fact, I've been immersed in the world of OKRs for 12 years at Google and now 4 years at Lyft. We use them very heavily. I think they are, as you said, David, a great way to communicate what's important and to make sure it sort of trickles down to your org. So they bring alignment. They also typically are very measurable. So, good OKRs lead to, metrics that you can track. And so that goes back to, again, your top metric to track productivity and health of your org. If you see that you're consistently behind on your OKRs, that may mean something is wrong, right? Also, I think OKRs are a way to push, your team to do more, and you have to use that wisely. Like if you make your OKRs overly aggressive, then you lose people. They won't believe in them, and they might just actually, not even try. If you make them, too timid, too tentative, too sort of less aggressive, then maybe you could do more, and you're sandbagging. So I think the art of the OKR is to set it to be just aggressive enough. And Google had the rule of thumb that you should aim to achieve in the order of 70% of your OKRs. If you run that number, it means they were aggressive enough, but not too aggressive. So
100%. When I was at Google from 2006 to 2008, like back when, I don't know, people were still sort of figuring out what OKRs were. And when I think of like the one thing that most folks that adapt or adopt OKRs in their organization, like the part that they forget or omit or don't take on, it's the one that you just mentioned, that kind of like aim for 70%-ish, give or take, so that it's aggressive enough, but not too aggressive. So often we see organizations that kind of have these OKRs where they know they're going to achieve them, or the opposite, where it's kind of such a moonshot that it's like you said, like, why try? 100%.
Yep.
So this next question actually for Luc, related to, we're talking about specific numbers for some of these ratios. So from Divya, what average ratio of junior to senior engineers worked for you in the past? I know folks tend to ask themselves, like, should I be hiring more junior folks? Should I be hiring more senior folks? Like, are there any rough numbers I should look at?
I would say, again, it probably depends. Rule of thumb for me is like half and half. And again, you may define junior in different ways and for different orgs, right? Depending on the problem space you're on. But usually you want half and half, because this way you can have like typically one more senior mentor for one more junior person, and that's the way teams often organize. So yeah, roughly half and half would be my best guess as to what's healthy, and maybe Pooja can add to this.
Yeah, like when I think about distribution at an org level, right, I typically am looking for a bell curve distribution, right? Is that you have early entry level engineers, you have on the other extreme, you have principal staff, sort of folks who are experts in their craft, and then you have a large set of folks that are in the middle, right? And that's sort of like your, for us it would be like lead to like senior engineers, right? Where they've sort of moved beyond the mentorship piece, right? As in like they can take something and move it forward fairly autonomously. However, they're not in a place where they can impact a large part of productivity for the rest of engineers. So like, I think that's the shape, but I think like Luc, like it ends up being, you're right, like 50-50 or so. When you think about each specific organization, but when I look at larger organizations, that's the curve I'm hoping to see across the levels.
Yeah. And you're totally right. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying here.
If you have a bell curve in the very middle, you'll get 50-50, right? So
good point.
Fair enough. The other thing I reflect on is that the stage of your organization matters quite a bit, right? So obviously, you all being at larger organizations, like you'll get that bell curve. But when you're, let's say, a 5-person startup, a 10-person startup, or you're hiring your first few engineers, that it's a great question, one that I've certainly struggled with myself. And like, it depends on the situation, right? Because if you're doing a really complicated, let's say, NLP product that needs specialization in the early days for your MVP, maybe you'll need a senior NLP person. But if you're throwing up, an easy to create like React app, maybe somebody more junior could work, right?
Totally.
Cool. All right. This next question is from Hamed. What metrics? Oh wait, no. I think we already answered that one. I'm going to go to Marco. Marco, could you make examples of OKRs? Are they per product team? I know we kind of touched on this in terms of examples, but I think this question is related to, when you're taking them and trickling them down from the top, so to speak, like how do you do that breakdown? Do you break it down per product team, per engineering team, per business unit, et cetera?
It's sort of interesting, we've recently moved to the whole concept of single-threaded leaders, right? And single-threaded leaders at a company, if you're not familiar with that concept, Amazon, there's like parts of it in various companies. Like I feel like Amazon talked a lot about it, similar to the two pizza teams. There's a single-threaded leader. Now you can talk about it. It's sort of like the people say the throat to choke or the back to pat. Like you can decide whichever you want, right?
The DRI in some.
Yes, like complete, like your responsibility. Like I think the reason I brought that up is that at a company level, and now again, like we are a public company, we've been around for 8 years. We're, the size of the engineering teams and data science teams we're at about 600 now. So I would take this as a point from, you have to assess it for the right stage and size of your organization. But going back to the question, right, is that those single-threaded leaders today now define strategic OKRs, right? And now they're for the line of business that they're responsible for, right? And now that's where you start trickling that down to what that means for product, what that means for engineering teams, what that means for actually the product engineering scrum teams, and how they align with that lines of business. So that's sort of how, instead of like sort of the specific products and features, right, we end up aligning it to the single-threaded leader and the lines of business that they're responsible for. I think where this becomes somewhat challenging is, how do you think about platform teams, right? And platform/infrastructure teams. And, I advocate there is like, you actually need separate tech OKRs, right? And these are technology OKRs that we do create that are, for example, there'll be things like, how do you reduce rote work, right? It's like there's some measure around things that are rote and how much of that can be actually automated. What is the time taken for mean time to recovery? And being able to measure that and reduce that. So then there you have like some amount of business context to it. They're measurable. And then you move away from the buzzword compliant of, well, we got to do Terraform, or we got to do pick your new thing, right? Which is great, right? That like we're entirely on IAS, like don't get me wrong, but it aligns with why you're doing it and which lever of the business that you can actually move. Luke, I'm curious, does that align with your experience with Google?
I think, well, first off, I think right now in my current role, I'm one of these single-threaded leaders. So I help, with my leadership team define the very top-level objectives. We do this typically on a yearly basis for the year, and these objectives, are, what you bring your full context, which you have, which is broader than typically the rest of the employees in the org, to help define and articulate. But then I think we typically use a process where teams will, use this context of these top-level OKRs or objectives to define their own goals and align them to that. And then we have kind of a back and forth. We align the specific KRs that we want to, to get to. So there is this back and forth, and at the very top level, the OKRs are going to typically involve the entire organization. So then we can track them as, as a program in some way. And so you're right that where does infrastructure fit into this? The top level OKRs are usually very much product OKRs, but you do have to make room for the infrastructure that enables everything, the tooling, and also just the maintenance. To be honest, if you don't, if all your OKRs are going to consume your entire team without any resources being devoted to code health, maintenance, refactors and all that, then you are going to eventually fail. So you have to make room for that. And again, a ratio, in some teams I was at Google, we use like 10 to 20% of the effort, and therefore the OKRs was around these maintenance/refactor projects. So these are some thoughts.
My takeaways from both of you is that while there's still this kind of top level setting the stage and trickling down that goes, into the various business units or product areas or, revenue generating stream, as it were, is in addition to that, you need to pay attention to whether that be your infrastructure or optimizing the efficiency of your internal teams, et cetera, to be able to, look at what are some of those behind the scenes things that ultimately affect revenue, but maybe aren't necessarily top of mind, and that sometimes you need to craft OKRs for those specific areas, whether that be infrastructure or beyond, which makes total sense. We have just about a little over a minute left, so maybe time for one last question. This one from Yinner Salazar. Do you use any metrics to measure happiness in your teams?
Well, we have, speaking for Lyft, and the same is true in many, many orgs, we use an engagement survey, which is probably the best indicator. And so there are different questions that lead to an overall, I would say, engagement score for people and therefore for teams. And that's a useful metric. Again, what's useful is to see it in comparison to what it was before, or, to compare one team to the other. In absolute number, they're not that useful, but they give you a lot of insight as to what you need to focus on as a leader. Pooja, you want to comment on this too?
No, I think +1 to that. In addition to that, another thing that we've started is what we're calling as pulse surveys, right? As we have some pretty broad initiatives that we are accelerating on, in a bi-weekly cadence, have like 2 or 3 questions, almost like an NPS survey that we repeat. And that's helping a lot keep a track on a much more granular basis. Is how is the team doing? Like, would you recommend working on this initiative or not? And that's resulting in a lot of new information that sometimes the larger cadence of engagement surveys you can lose. But I think both in combination can give you a good indicator of team happiness.
Excellent. Well, with that, Luc and Pooja, thank you so much for your time and to give all of the wisdom that you have. I love that we touched on, not only, again, that happiness side, but also some real hard metrics, some real methodologies, some real numbers and perspectives. Those specifics, I think, were incredibly useful for folks who are, in some cases, doing this for the first time. So thank you both so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invite.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.